Thanks for tuning in to the Pacey Performance Podcast. So this afternoon, I'm delighted to welcome Ken Clark. So welcome to the podcast, mate.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Pleasure to have you. Thank you very much. Feels like I know you, having spent the last hour and a half watching your Altis presentation. So thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, glad you're able to watch that. That was a great platform, and just really excited to be here and talking all things speed. So.
Absolutely. So anyone who doesn't know who you are, do you just want to give us a bit of an intro on yourself, what you're doing now, what you've done previously, different S&C career, coaching, academia, all the above?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess my athletic background started, youth and high school. Played American football and baseball in high school. Not really a great genetically gifted athlete, so I was always working really hard just to try to get better, to get stronger and faster. I think, like many people in our field, that's the case. Played small college football and then got into coaching after that. Initially was in American football for 2 years and then transitioned into strength and conditioning, and was really interested in just trying to help my athletes again get faster, stronger, and seeing if there was established methods or methods that we could develop to help those athletes consistently make great improvements. After about 8 to 10 years in the strength and conditioning field, both in college and then in the private sector, I really got interested in the academic and research side of things. So in 2007, I did a master's degree. I was lucky enough to have some great mentors at Westchester University. We researched resisted sprint training. And then after that, the research bug really got to me. And so in 2010, went down to Southern Methodist University, studied with Dr. Peter Wayne and Dr. Larry Ryan in the SMU Locomotor Lab, which I think a lot of people know there's some great research that comes out of there. I was there from 2010 to 2015. It was an incredible experience. And then in 2015, a job opening came up at Westchester, which was my alma mater, and teaching biomechanics and motor learning. And I jumped at that opportunity to be back in the Philadelphia area and at Westchester. And I've been back at Westchester for the last 5 years and teach biomechanics, motor learning, do research in running mechanics, sprinting mechanics, and I'm also lucky enough that I've been involved in strength and conditioning and sprint training at Westchester. I'm a volunteer assistant sprints coach with the track team as well. So it's a really nice mix of teaching, researching, and coaching at Westchester.
Awesome. I can definitely relate to that with your experience as an athlete. Okay, not particularly genetically gifted, but tried really hard. Tried hard.
Yeah, that was me to a T. No one would ever confuse me with Usain Bolt. I'll put it that way.
No, likewise. But like we were saying just before I hit record, it's an unbelievable time to be involved in speed training. Lots of unbelievable stuff going on. You mentioned the work of Altis beforehand, and they're doing some amazing stuff. And just putting the platform out there for the likes of yourself and other researchers and practitioners to share their work. What an exciting time.
Yeah, I think it's great. There's incredible online resources, as you mentioned, like the Altus education platforms. I've been really lucky to be involved with Stu and Andreas and Dan and all those guys there. I think there's just some really great researchers around the world who are doing incredible things from a speed science standpoint, if you will. As I mentioned, Peter Wayne and the SMU Locomotive Performance Lab, obviously have researchers like J.B. Marin and the Bezotis brothers. I'm also lucky enough to get to work with Dr. Ralph Mann and Amber Murphy with USA Track and Field. So there's just so many great minds, and I know I'm forgetting people left and right. Michal Cahill and John Cronin and some of the things they're doing with youth speed development. So just so many great minds and great research groups around the world that there's just a lot of exciting things in the world of speed for sure. So.
Absolutely. So one thing I want to chat to you about first off, and it's something that's come up quite a few times, and I'm always a little bit cautious of going over old ground, but I think it's certainly not old ground because it's new perspectives. So
sure.
that'll be really interesting. So the sprint model. So people may look at Stu's stuff that goes out online and think, okay, I'm working with team sport athletes. Should I be mirroring my technical model on my athletes from Stu's? And I'd just like to get your take on that, really, of judging that team sport athlete on a sprint model.
Yeah, I mean, I like Stu's quote, and this is usually my starting point with this discussion, and this quote has become famous, and basically it's that we know that team sport athletes and sprinters aren't going to run the same way, either in training or on the field, but basically it's important that team sport athletes understand the rules of acceleration and top speed mechanics before, the game breaks those rules, if you will. So I think it's, important to look at it from a few perspectives. So first of all, we know that the occurrences for which team sport athletes or in which team sport athletes hit maximum velocity in a game situation are relatively rare. But on the flip side of that coin, it's still important that they train at top speed. Number two, that there's a lot of constraints, whether it's different visual focus, the need to change direction, barriers on the field or sidelines, that sort of thing. They have a lot of different constraints on the field that are affecting the way they run. And so getting back to your original question, when we watch a team sport athlete on the field of play, are they going to run like a 100-meter sprinter? Clearly not. I mean, there's very few situations, perhaps unless it's a real breakaway situation where they're just doing a 40 to 50 meter linear sprint, where they're going to get into their upright max velocity mechanics. And even then, only some of them will resemble a sprinter. But from my perspective, perhaps I'm a little bit biased, it's still important that we do teach those athletes a basic technical model for both acceleration and top speed. And then again, as Stu's quote goes, then knowing that their mechanics will change in a game situation when the constraints of the game, whether it's the sideline, the opponent, the ball, etc., causes them to run a little bit differently. I think that teaching team sport athletes good mechanics and teaching to a technical model is really important for a couple of reasons. Number one, decreasing the risk of soft tissue injury during high-speed sprinting in training, whether that's in practice or off-season conditioning or et cetera. If we don't teach mechanics, acceleration or top speed, I think just qualitatively speaking, there's going to be an increased risk of injury. So if nothing else, we want to teach to a technical model for that reason. Number two, if improving mechanics can enhance speed in training from that improvement in technique, that's going to allow for greater stimulus. So just teaching the mechanics for better training results allows for better training stimulus. So that's the second reason. Number three, if there's even a little bit of transfer, just a little bit from the technique training that we do in practice, acceleration or top speed, that translates or transfers to a game situation, then from my standpoint, it's worth it. Maybe it's just a little bit as far as posture or pelvic position or that sort of thing. If that even just changes a few degrees on the pitch or court or field, then perhaps they're going to run a little bit faster or be a little bit less likely to get injured, strain a hamstring, for example. So I think, no, we should not perhaps hold them to the same exact technical model as a sprinter, but there's definitely some key attractors that we want to teach towards with our team sport athletes for acceleration and top speed. And I think there's some really important reasons: decreasing the risk of injury, enhancing speed for stimulus, perhaps getting a little bit of transfer to a game situation, why we want to, always teach good mechanics with our team sport athletes. A really long-winded answer to a short question.
No, that's great. Keep going. That's fantastic. I'd just like to dive into that first point. And it's ironic that you should say that, because I spend a bit of time going through old podcast episodes and picking out good bits for social media, little videos and things. Yep. And one that I came across was JB Marin's, as you mentioned him before.
Sure. Yep.
And it was a clip when he was talking about exactly that. Is there a safer way to sprint to decrease the risk of injury when these athletes make their way to the field or court?
Yep.
And you said it was maybe not something that's there in the research now. Is there anything research-wise on a safer way to sprint along the injury lines or not?
I'll only speak anecdotally here, because I can't cite studies off the top of my head. I think some of this research is in the works. But I think, generally speaking, you could look to probably three or four major points that you're looking for. I mean, first would be posture. And I think this is both acceleration and top speed, really, from first step all the way throughout. Just having a neutral posture, head to heel, so to speak, that's going to set up the pelvic position, which in my opinion is arguably the most important. Training team sport athletes to have a relatively more neutral pelvis is really key. So many athletes, and I deal a lot with American football as it relates to team sport athletes. So many of those athletes have anterior tilt, and that causes a lot of issues. And that's both, they have an anterior tilt both structurally and the way they, just kind of sit all 8 hours of the day, and the way that they play. So teaching those athletes to perhaps have a little bit more of a neutral tilt is important for both just speed, making them faster, but also injury risk. And I'll get into that more in a second. So first two would be posture and pelvic position. Number three would be, backside and front side thigh movement. Again, backside movement referring to how much the thigh swings back behind the torso line during the swing phase, and front side thigh movement referring to how much in front of the body or in front of that line the thigh is. So generally guiding the thigh movement to occur a little bit more in front of the body. Again, are they going to look like a sprinter? Perhaps not, but trying to reduce excessive backside mechanics in the team sport athletes. And then lastly, having a stiff ground contact that aims to strike under the center of mass. That's not really going to happen past the first two steps, but I think it's a good coaching point, a good aiming point. So all four of those points are really key. And I like to talk to them from a top-down approach. Basically, if the posture is off, if the torso is really hanging forward, hunched forward, or if they're in some sort of arched position, and Cameron Jossi talks about that a lot, I believe. He's got some categories that are great. But if the upper body, the trunk and torso are off, that's going to negatively affect things down the chain, specifically the pelvis. And then once you look at the pelvis, once the pelvis gets into anterior tilt, it gets really difficult to have reasonably good front side mechanics, to get good thigh lift in front of the body. And with anterior tilt, or at least excessive anterior tilt, that also has a negative cascade of events down the chain. That's going to lead to relatively more backside mechanics. And then as the thigh swings in front of the body and as the foot swings in front of the body, generally speaking, that's going to lead to the foot landing further in front of the center of mass. So from posture to pelvic position to thigh mechanics, and then to where the foot is striking. And so if the posture's off and the pelvis is off, and then the athlete's landing further in front of them, to me, that's where you end up getting into some risk of soft tissue injury. So without getting into any studies that have quantified this yet, although again, I think that research is probably on its way, but generally speaking, working its way down from posture to pelvis to thigh motion to ground contact, I do think there's clearly better ways to execute sprint mechanics that are both safer, reducing the risk of soft tissue injury, and that enhance performance. I mean, generally speaking, all of those same four things that we just talked about as far as reducing injury risk are also going to be good for sprint performance. So I see it as a win-win. And even if we're not teaching team sport athletes to necessarily need to exactly match a 100-meter sprint technical model, generally guiding them towards those positions, shapes, however you want to phrase it, is I think a good idea.
A cascade effect.
Definitely. Yeah. I like to look at it from a top on down. You could view it ground up as well, but at least for me, both from a researcher's eye and a coach's eye, to me, I typically look top down, and I think that's an easy way to think about it, and also to perhaps make corrections.
So put your coach's hat on. Would you start with the posture, and oftentimes other things will take care of themselves, or would you be hitting each individual component across that cascade?
Yeah, so great question. So let's first start, by saying that, as I think a lot of your guests have said before, individualization is key, right? So a lot of athletes are going to have their own different individual corrections that needs to be made, and so having a coaching eye that's treating every athlete as an individual and correcting them individually is key. But as a general rule, yeah, absolutely. Treating posture and pelvic position as 1A and 1B, if you will, because just from my experience and also kind of from biomechanical foundations, if the posture and the pelvic position is off, it's going to be pretty challenging for that athlete to do the other things correctly. I mean, if your torso's hanging forward, or if you have, if the back is arched and the pelvis is really anteriorly rotated, you can cue the athlete all you want to hey, get your thigh up in front of you, or that sort of thing. It's just not going to happen. Yeah. And then likewise, if they have, if the posture is misaligned and the pelvis is anteriorly rotated to an excessive degree, the thigh is most likely going to swing too far back behind the body. That's going to cause them to strike out in front, no matter how much you cue it. So again, with my coach's hat on, and I want to give a shout out to the Westchester University head track coach here, Jason Kilgore. When we teach our sprinting mechanics with our sprinters, either developmental or even with our upperclassmen, I mean, literally the first rule is posture, posture, posture. And that goes along with the pelvic position as well. We emphasize that all the time. Now, to take a half step back, if we're doing some other drills as part of our warm up, I mean, just the classic stuff like marches and skips and straight leg runs and step overs, are we emphasizing all of those qualities at different times in those drills? 100%. Yeah. But, with our step overs and our straight leg runs, I mean, we're definitely, emphasizing ground contact and front side action and that sort of thing, but never to the detriment of posture and pelvic positions.
Of course. Is there anything you do that focuses specifically on them first 2 points, them posture and pelvis?
Everything.
Okay. Yeah.
No, but I mean, I think I think my answer here will probably align with a lot of your previous guests. So, I mean, it's actually just a constant focus. So everything in warm up, whether it's our hurdle mobility drills, whether it's our dynamic warm up, and the sprint drills that I just mentioned, and I like to keep it really simple with just marches, skips, straight leg runs, step overs. With our track team, we use a lot of mini hurdles, wickets. So we do a lot of that, and that is clearly emphasizing posture, pelvic position, that sort of thing. But no, nothing that's really different, I don't think, or unique, but really just attention to detail on those things, on a really constant basis.
Mm-hmm. So just diving into some of your research on this next topic, which is the differences and potential similarities of a team sport athlete and a elite sprinter, or a team sport athlete, a sprinter, and a recreational athlete. What are the different? I mean, this could be like, I guess we could probably go all day with this next question, but what are the differences and what are the similarities?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with top speed, actually, and then we'll work our way backwards to acceleration and transitional acceleration. So most of my research is in top speed. That comes from my time at the SMU Locomotor Lab with Peter Wayne and Larry Ryan, and also some of the stuff I'm doing now at Westchester. The long story short is this. To run faster, ground contact times have to be shorter. Basically, the faster you go, the shorter the ground contact time is. There's always a vertical impulse requirement. Most runners spend about 0.12 seconds in the air. That means that everybody has a certain vertical impulse requirement in the ground contact time, in the time that they're applying force. The faster you go, the shorter the ground contact time, the larger the vertical forces need to be. So that's kind of a good starting place. So very generally speaking, if you look at a heterogeneous population of recreational trained athletes to team sport athletes to competitive sprinters, the faster athletes, i.e. the sprinters, are going to apply larger mass-specific vertical forces in shorter ground contact time. So that's kind of like big bullet point number one of top speed. And then you get into the how are they doing that? And Peter Wayne has published studies from 2000 to 2010 that showed that greater mass-specific vertical force and shorter ground contact time for faster runners. I was lucky enough that as part of my doctoral research, we kind of were able to build on that. And what we showed was, specifically, if you look at competitive sprinters, we had both elite sprinters and sub-elite sprinters, and then team sport athletes, that the faster sprinters are able to apply more vertical force, specifically in the first portion of ground contact. And that really you can start to tie in some of these kinematics with the kinetics. In other words, the good posture, the good front side mechanics, a really aggressive ground strike, and a stiff ground contact. What that leads to is a high rate of force application, vertical force application we're talking here, in the first portion of ground contact. And so counterintuitively, if you looked at the second half of ground contact, competitive sprinters and team sport athletes and recreational athletes were all kind of the same. The quote unquote push off from a vertical force standpoint was all basically the same, but the faster sprinters were applying more force in the first half of ground contact. So I'll tie that in with some of my current research as well, coming out of the Westchester lab. And it's not only the posture and the front side mechanics, but the ability to really attack the ground with a high angular velocity of the limb, of the thigh, rotating back towards the ground, causes a high vertical velocity of the lower limb, of the foot, ankle, and shank as it contacts the ground. And that leads to the big impact forces vertically. And then you combine that with the ability to be stiff, and that's how these elite sprinters and faster runners, generally speaking, are generating more vertical force in the early portion of ground contact. Now, I'll come back to the horizontal forces at top speed momentarily, but let's now start to work our way back. So from top speed, okay, to run faster, got to have shorter ground contact times, need to have more force in less time to meet the impulse requirements, and the faster runners are doing that by good front side mechanics, aggressive ground strike, stiff ground contact, more vertical force. If we go back to initial acceleration and transitional acceleration, and this is where the research of J.B. Marin and colleagues, Matt Cross, Pierce Amazino, and then more recently, Ryu Nagahara, of course, Stephanie Collier. I want to make sure I shout out all the great research groups, but basically greater horizontal propulsive forces in the early acceleration phase, and then a continued ability to attenuate the eccentric forces during transitional acceleration and continue to apply horizontal propulsive forces. So again, Newtonian mechanics kind of tells all of this from the initial acceleration all the way to top speed. This nicely aligns with basic Newton's laws. But just to reiterate, in the initial acceleration phase, you have to apply enough vertical force to support your body weight. And then basically you want the rest of the force directed backwards so that the action-reaction forces propel you forwards. Therefore, more anterior, posterior, or more anterior propulsive force early, and then continue to attenuate the braking forces and keep the force vector directed anteriorly during transitional acceleration. Last thing I'll hit here is there's been a very recent study, I think it came out 2 days ago, that I wanted to try to mention. I'm not going to be able to pronounce this researcher's last name appropriately. I apologize. But Hans von Leers and Wilkow and the Bezotis brothers, JB, and I think Gareth Stamford, that group, Scott Simpson, they had a really interesting study looking at sprinters at various phases throughout the sprint. And if we look at the top speed portion, they also showed that the peak propulsive forces were greater in the faster runners, which is interesting to me. Although I need to give this much deeper a read and review, my initial interpretation is as follows. You could kind of sum it up by saying that faster runners apply the force vector more vertically during the early portion of ground contact, much more vertical force early on, as some of our research has shown. And then during the second half of ground contact, they direct the force vector more horizontally, greater peak propulsive forces. That's kind of my take, which is a really neat scientific interpretation of all this great research that's come out in the last 10 years or so. So sorry, that was a really long answer.
No, please. I don't know. Yeah, definitely don't apologize. No apology needed for great information. Please don't. Yeah, definitely not. We've all seen I think we've all seen, I'll try to describe it as best I can, the treadmill, the two side-by-side treadmills with the was it a recreational athlete or was it a team sport?
He was actually, yeah, he was a team sport athlete. Yeah, he was a university lacrosse player who he wasn't, his mechanics weren't good, but he wasn't slow. He could run about 20 miles an hour, 9 meters a second. But yes, yeah.
So in that example, and again, that was just coming to my mind because of what you presented in your Altis presentation. Sure. Is that, I mean, how old is that? That's a couple of years old with the.
That is, yeah. So I believe that was about 2012, 2013 when that video was first filmed, something like that. So,
yeah. So the take-home points back then and how that looks and how you were presenting it, is all them take-home messages from 2012 been backed up in what's coming out now and how the field is moving on, or is there certain things that potentially thought back then that maybe we're starting to think slightly differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and those that slide, as I said in the Altus presentation, was put up strictly for point of contrast. I
Of
mean, that
course.
was like the best of the best sprinter mechanics, towards a technical model, and the worst of the worst, if you will.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think there is some gray area for sure. Both, there's certainly, a bandwidth around the certain aspects of top speed technique, even if you look at various sprinters. I think there's key positions absolutely that you want to hit, and general shapes that need to be hit. I've seen perhaps a little bit more a bandwidth or variability than just strictly what's in that one point of comparison video. I don't think that there's any doubt though that sprinters, at least if you look at a 100-meter dash, they need to hit a certain high knee position, in a position to attack the ground, apply a lot of force, and then not only have the thigh accelerate down towards the ground, but have the thigh accelerate through ground contact. That fact is still really true, and really no different than what we were talking about back then. And certain aspects of physics don't lie. You still need to apply a lot of vertical force and short contact times. As far as the team sport athletes, I guess the only point where my probably perspective has changed a little bit is, just a better understanding of, hey, in a game situation, they're rarely going to run like this. What does that mean as far as how we train them? And I think my pendulum swung one way, swung all the way back, and now I'm somewhere back in the middle of just, kind of touching upon what we said earlier, which is understanding that, hey, in a game situation, they're rarely going to perhaps run like this because the game constraints. But with that being said, you still want to teach to a technical model and training for various reasons, just understanding that they are perhaps rarely going to look like a sprinter, that sort of thing.
So I asked this to Stu when I had him on probably quite a few months ago now, probably 3 or 4 months
Yeah.
ago. At what point, and this was his answer, I think, seem to remember, was something like, that's the art of coaching. So maybe this is going to be your answer as well. But at what
Yeah.
point does that switch over to become a little bit more contextual of, we have that technical model, we've been moving
Yep.
towards that technical model, things are improving, but we do know that's not going to happen very, very often on the field or court. So we're going to now transition a little bit over to something that looks a little bit more like what happens on the field or court. At what point does that happen?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm certainly not a coach to the level of Stu. That's for sure. I can only say with the athletes that I coach, the team sport athletes, that I'm just always looking for a gradual progression towards some of those key attractors, if you will, and just kind of knowing that when I do video analysis or just when I'm watching them live speed, just knowing that it's rarely going to look exactly like the sprinter, but knowing that that's generally where I want them to progress to. And that, I guess if I had to track back to my previous answer, just knowing that if even there can be some semblance of that on the field, that's the victory. I think that if there's a break ball, rugby, you name it, that if they're able to get into those mechanics at all, that's a great thing. Just putting my coach's eye on as I look as a a fan, if you will. It's really interesting to watch some of the faster athletes like a Carlin Isles or some American football wide receivers. You get a real diversity. Some of the faster athletes in breakaway situations get into mechanics that almost look very much like a sprinter, and some don't and are still quite fast, even though they don't have quote unquote sprint mechanics. So that's really not just that's not an answer per se, just an observation. But I think it's interesting, and I guess I'm going to continue to progress my answer to that question over time, just from getting a better understanding of what really the fast team sport athletes are doing on the field. So
Absolutely, no, that's great. So my next point, a little bit of a transition, and go towards
sure,
more the profiling side of things. And
absolutely.
this came from, again, my going through old episodes. This one not so old, and it was Jonas Dodoo, who you've mentioned already, especially
Yep.
before we hit record. And it was his explanation of profiling his guys through acceleration. And although two athletes may get very similar times, what happens after that is the transition past that, if it's a 10-meter time that we're looking at for acceleration, What happens during that 10 meters and what's going to happen after is actually what's important, not the actual time itself, because some people may be in a position to get faster and faster and faster, and some maybe not. So in that profiling question, what's your philosophy when it comes to that, and putting the coach's hat back on, when it comes to profiling and actually what is important and how you go about it?
Yeah, so great question, and I love this topic. So I'll try to wear both coach and researcher hats here. So from a profiling, how do you do it? I mean, I typically go with one of two methods. I mean, I have a radar gun, which I have from the lab, but I can use it with the athletes I coach as well. So if it's literally just comes down to collecting radar data and getting velocity time data, I do that on, I'd say, somewhat infrequent basis, although I do it, and then more often than not, just getting split time data from an automatic timing system, but then fitting the velocity time profile from that. In other words, using the split time data to velocity profile. And I think the point you brought up is so important. There are certainly game situations where, for team sport athletes, the ability to accelerate 10 yards that's it. You're just beating an opponent to a spot with a ball, and it doesn't really matter what happens, 11 yards and beyond. But for either sprinters or team sport athletes in other circumstances, it's not a race to 10 yards or 10 meters. For example, on day one of training our sprinters in the blocks at Westchester, we say you never win a conference championship for who's in first place at 10 meters. It's a 100-meter dash. And the goal, as you just said, is not to be first to 10 meters if it doesn't set you up well for the rest of the sprint. I mean, the goal of the start and initial acceleration is, of course, to be fast and powerful, but it has to set you up well for the rest of the sprint. And I think that's where velocity profiling, is really key. So the way I like to do it is as follows. I typically will do, split times and then model the velocity versus time profile from there, and then get a Vmax, a maximum velocity, a maximum acceleration, and a tau value, which is the acceleration time constant. That's essentially the same for those listeners who are familiar with all the great work that JB and Pierce Amazino and Matt Cross have done. That's essentially the same as V naught, F naught, and the forceful slope. So from those characteristics, you can basically put one single number on what's the athlete's top speed, what's their initial acceleration, and the tau value, which is really interesting to me, is how well does the athlete accelerate relative to top speed. So you can compare athletes across the board, but if an athlete makes training gains, like let's say you work with them over 10 weeks or 12 weeks and they get faster, the profiling of those three metrics allows you specific insight as to, did their max velocity get better? Did their initial acceleration get better? How did they accelerate relative to top speed? And I guess one could argue, well, you can just do that just from the split times themselves. But this gives you a little bit more specific insight as to, did they have a global improvement in speed? Did they just get faster in all areas? Or did they get faster in one specific area? If we were targeting initial acceleration with some heavy resisted sled runs, for example, were we successful in improving their initial acceleration, their F naught, if you will? If we were really targeting their top speed, were we successful in that? So I like to do velocity profiling and Vmax, Amax, and tau, or if you want to phrase it, F naught, V naught, F naught, and force velocity slope, for those reasons. I think it's great to compare athletes against each other and athletes within themselves. Last thing I'll say is, again, has been popularized by other groups in Europe, the individualized training approach, where you can do force velocity profiling or velocity profiling and see where an athlete is relatively weaker. I think is really really key, and I think that allows for some great insights as to not applying a one size fits all approach. I think there's certainly some global speed development things that all athletes need to work on, but using that information, which is easy to access with current technology, to dictate exercise prescription, if you will, speed training prescription, I think is really key. So
would that change or be modified, or you'd be looking for slightly different nuances within that for a team sport athlete versus a sprinter?
Yeah. So, and again, I think there's going to be some research on this that's probably forthcoming, if I had to guess. But slightly different velocity profiles for team sport athletes and sprinters. And I'm not talking about the absolute velocity. I think everyone who knows speed training, understands that sprinters, all things being equal, hit faster max velocities deeper into the run. I mean, that's well known. But if you look at one reason why I like the tau value, which is the negative inverse of force velocity slope, the tau value tells you how the athlete is accelerating relative to their top speed. And for team sport athletes, they can accelerate a little bit faster relative to top speed than a sprinter. A sprinter, if they hit top speed at the 10-meter mark, well, they're done. Then they got 90 meters to decelerate. So that's no good. So we all know that the sprinters need to, accelerate maximally, and yet there's a specific 100-meter velocity profile that's going to lead to the best 100-meter time. And if they hit top speed too early, that's certainly not a good thing from an overall 100-meter standpoint. If you're looking at, for example, an American football player running a 40-yard dash, or a soccer or rugby player running a 30-meter sprint, that acceleration profile to optimize their performance is not going to necessarily be the same as a 100-meter sprinter. They don't have to worry about a deceleration phase. They're running 30 meters or 40 yards. So there are some specifics that you can get out of the velocity profiling and perhaps what's optimal for a 100-meter sprinter compared to what's optimal for a team sport athlete. Those are definitely different things due to the context of the sprint. So.
As Jonas mentioned when we started talking about it, obviously very rarely a team sport athlete will have to do nothing at the end of that 10-meter sprint or 30-meter sprint. They're going to have to react.
Yep.
They're going to have to stop and go the other way. Is there anything in terms of the shapes that you're looking for, or what you're seeing visually and potentially quantifying, that puts them in a better position at them times, whether it be whatever you're assessing, 10 or 30, to be able to do them other things, i.e. react or stop, or something that team sport athletes do?
Right. That's a great question. I guess the one thing I'm looking for, and this is going to be relatively qualitative, so nothing that I'm quantitatively measuring, but is how in control or out of control they are. So sometimes team sport athletes will run a sprint, especially if their mechanics haven't really been coached up. And I mean, it is guns blazing all over the place. 110%. Yeah, exactly. And even if the time is okay, they're just not in a position at the end of 30 meters or 40 yards to do anything athletic. I mean, if they don't flat out pull a hamstring at the end of that, they're certainly not in a position to change direction or decelerate or anything. So from a very qualitative standpoint, I of course want the mechanics to be good and the time to be fast, but that athlete should still be maintaining at the end of the run, 30 meters, 40 yards, whatever, mechanics that are, powerful but under control, not landing way out in front with limbs flailing to the point where you could coach them that if they needed to decelerate, they could. Perfect example is in American football, the kickoff, although that's slowly being phased out of the game. Athletes need to sprint, a relatively far distance, reach pretty fast top speeds and mechanics that are somewhat upright. But then if they're on the kickoff coverage, they need to be able to, break down and come to a stop to react to a ball carry so that they can make a tackle. That encompasses a lot of the qualities that you're talking about. So if an athlete was used to getting up into fast, at fast speeds with poor mechanics and out of control, they'd really be in terrible position to break down and make a tackle. So something, for that situation, just fast, powerful, but not all over the place, not out of control.
I know zero about American football, so
no problem.
Going slightly off topic here, but why the phasing out the kickoff?
Just I think due to concussions and injuries.
Oh right, okay.
Yeah,
that makes sense. When are they actually coming? Are they scheduled to come back September? Does anyone know?
The situation is fluid. I think so.
But it's supposed to be September, is it?
I think so. Yeah.
Current situation. Yeah. Okay. I understand. I hear you. So we've done 40 minutes, which has been superb so far, and I think what I tried to split it nicely into was kind of 3 20-minute chunks, and we're
Sure.
another 5 seconds, and I'm nearly there. Resisted sprints
Sure.
been the final point that I'd like to tap into. Again, I'm going to refer back to some things that have
Sure.
been talked about in previous episodes with Cam Jost, who broke down
Yeah.
the 40-meter split, and I think he presented it a very similar thing at again at Altis. Altis is getting a lot of love on this, by the way. Stu can send
Well
me
deserved.
yeah, absolutely. Stu can send me the £5 in the post. But yeah, he presented that and the 40-meter time and how he split it into 10,
Yep.
20, 30, and where different exercises fit to actually enhance those qualities within them splits. But in that, and maybe not having that as a structure, but I think it's quite nice because I've just tried to describe it as well as I could. But where does heavy, well, not heavy, but we can go with heavy first. Where does heavy resistance training fit in that model as I've just described from Cam?
Yeah, the resisted sprint training. I mean, I think undoubtedly, you're looking at the ability to apply initial propulsive force in start and initial acceleration, which would be 10 to 20 yards, the first 10 to 20 yards. So also, Cam, that was an incredible podcast. I listened to that one with you. He is an extremely bright guy. I've had some really good interaction with him. But I love the way he analyzes, sprinting for team sport athletes. And I think a lot of the research, again, there's been several studies that have come out lately to name drop and give credit where it's due. But J.B. Marin and his group, Johan Latti has done some with rugby players and I think professional soccer players. One research group that I've been proud to be involved with is with Mihal Cahill and John Cronin, looking at it in team sport athletes in high school males. So so the research is starting to become pretty conclusive that heavy resisted sprint training in team sport athletes is effective for improving initial acceleration. And I've used it a lot myself, coaching team sport athletes, specifically American football players. We use it with the Westchester track and field team with our sprinters. And I love it for a couple of reasons. So number one, I think sometimes there's a complaint per se that, hey, if you really load up athletes heavy, that you're going to get some detrimental technique changes. I think there's going to be some research that shows that that's, in the long term, what the long-term transfer is, that's just not the case. So I don't see any real negative long-term transfer of changes in technique. If anything, I would argue the opposite. So one thing we've noticed with our Westchester sprinters is if you do resisted sleds specifically, and you've got the heavy load and the straps behind the athlete, it can actually give a really nice environmental constraint to say, hey, don't let your heels hit the straps behind you. Keep the thigh recovery in front of you as you kind of push punch with the thighs. So applying a lot of force down and back into the ground, at the same time keeping the thigh recovery relatively front side. So ironically, I actually love heavy resisted sprints almost as a technical cue for the athletes, in addition to specific force producing capabilities. And so not only with our sprinters, with the team sport athletes I train, and then some of the research I've been involved with Mihal Cahill and others, I think that you're seeing the ability to just basically get off the line and apply a lot of force. That's where it's really effective. From the research that's out there, and then also my own personal experience, and frankly, from my master's thesis way back when, I don't think it's as effective at top speed once you're past 20 yards. Okay. There's probably a little bit of debate about that. And I'm not talking, heavy sled training. I don't personally do any resisted sprint training past 20 yards, although I know there's a lot of great coaches and other practitioners who do. So that's perhaps a little bit of area of, just debate. But to me, I think it's most effective 0 to 20. And for those who are going to do resisted sprint training past 20, clearly there, I would think you would want to do it with relatively lighter loads. The one argument that I would totally buy, or rationale, I suppose, that I would totally buy is if you're doing resisted sprint training and it's past 20 yards, once the athlete is into his or her upright mechanics, that it should be light. And I think it should be done with a waist harness to provide just a little bit of an environmental cue so that the athlete can feel that they need to bring the hips up and forward, because the resistance is just pulling the hips down and back a little bit. So I know some coaches who do it past 20 yards, some really good coaches for that matter. And the kind of the argument is, hey, we just do a little bit of light resistance to keep them projecting and pushing horizontally, and also to give a good hip position or a good feel for how the athlete needs to keep the hips up and in. And that rationale, I think, would be justified. So not something that I do with the athletes that I coach, but I think that the latter rationale there for doing light resisted sprints at top speed, I think is pretty reasonable. So that's kind of my view. But yeah, I think more and more coaches and researchers are going to get comfortable with loading up their athletes pretty heavy at the start, and even if the mechanics look a little bit different acutely, just knowing that in the long term that's going to lead to good changes in the ability to apply force early on, and good improvements in initial acceleration.
Yeah, I remember JB talking about the acute versus the chronic adaptations,
Sure.
and not been too scared with what you're seeing there and then, but knowing that's going to pay off in the longer term.
Yeah, and again, just to hit the point I already said, whereas perhaps 5 years ago I would be scared of that. Now it is an active cue, and Coach Jason Kilgore at Westchester that we give with our sprinters is, hey, push hard through the ground, and then the thighs got to recover in front of you. Your heels shouldn't be clipping the strap. Feet don't clip the strap of the sled, if you will. It's actually, we've seen from a technical standpoint that cue sometimes works better doing resisted sprint training for the start with our developmental sprinters than anything else, as far as teaching them how the ground strike, but then also the thigh recovery needs to happen during initial acceleration. So I think it's got multiple benefits.
So anyone watching on YouTube will see me scribbling down notes. So I may have missed this next bit, and you may just be repeating it. But why don't you use resisted sprints after 20 meters? Did you already say that?
Yeah.
And I've missed it.
No, I didn't say that. I guess part of it is just my own research. So my master's thesis looked at two forms of resisted sprint training specifically for top speed. This was not looking at initial acceleration. This was in American small college lacrosse players, male lacrosse players. And we did a 7-week training study. And we all know training studies are difficult and there's some confounding variables. But ironically, we found that the athletes who trained without resistance, we did resisted sleds and resisted vests, and then an unresisted group. And the group that trained unresisted made the biggest speed improvements. And it actually, they made bigger speed improvements than the group that trained with resisted sleds. Now, the study wasn't perfect, no study is, but that just from that research experience coupled with, the mechanics of speed and trying to emphasize a little bit more posture and the vertical force, that's kind of why I've gone away from doing resisted sprints past 20 yards. So again, putting my coaching hat on, when we do resisted sprints, whether it's with the Westchester track team or with the team sport athletes I coach, they're typically 20 meters, 20 yards or less, basically. So.
For those people that maybe haven't used this modality with and we'll go team sport athletes as an example.
Sure.
And you said that it was the biggest potential technical way to improve people technically early on. What would you suggest? Where would you suggest people start with weights and length of sprint and that type of thing to start off with, anyone that hasn't done this before?
Yeah, great question. So I think that's really key for anyone who's, not just listened to this podcast, but, has listened to all yours before, just all the research that's out there on heavy resisted sprints, diving right into really heavy loads of, 60, 70, 80% body mass. I think, is clearly not a great idea. Like anything else, it's got to be, progressive overload, that sort of thing. Particularly for developmental athletes who, you're not quite sure what their relative strength qualities are. So with the team sport athletes that I'm working with, we start at just like empty sled just to get used to pulling the harness and that sort of thing. And then every week progress it a little bit more. And I just do either automatic timing system based timing or actually video based timing, just knowing what the distance and the time is to get velocity measurements so that I know exactly kind of what percentage of maximum velocity they're at, what load is causing what velocity decrement, because I think there's a lot of great research out there by Matt Cross and others. You can't just put on a load as a percentage of body mass or just a load and say, hey, we're progressing it this way. The best way to do it, given the different friction of surfaces, et cetera, is to do it as a percentage of maximum velocity and what percentage decrease you're doing. So gradually, I've just progressed it over the course of 4 to 5 weeks if I have an athlete for a long period of time, until at about the 4th or 5th week, we're working at a load where the athlete is at roughly 50% velocity decrease. So that's where some of the literature is pointing as optimal loading for doing the heavy resisted sprints. And so again, a gradual progressive overload, building them up. I haven't had any problems doing it that way as far as athletes, any increased risk of injury or athletes complaining. And from a technical standpoint, again, this is just purely qualitative with my coaching hat on and not my research hat. But from a qualitative standpoint, that allows the athletes to get a feel for it, for lack of a better term, to gradually get the feel for the load behind them and still running with good mechanics. One other thing I want to point out too, why I like the resisted sprints from a technical standpoint, with team sport athletes who have a tendency to spin the wheels really fast, like the high turnover at the start and initial acceleration, but they're just not completing their pushes, if you will. They're not getting anywhere. They're not projecting. The load behind them, the resistance behind them, provides, again, a good cue or constraint, or however you want to phrase it, that they really need to apply force and project out with their initial steps. And so for athletes that perhaps are spinning the wheels and not getting anywhere, or the limbs are recovering way behind them in initial acceleration, I think the sled actually is a really great teaching tool. The resistance sled is actually a really great teaching tool, in addition to of course, the force producing capabilities that you're working on. So
that was actually my next point. So we all know that, especially in team sports, it's time's limited. So using this as a teaching tool could be the way to go to actually try to maximize the 50 minutes or the 20 minutes that you've got maybe per week to actually make some improvements, transfer onto the pitch, but the technical aspect as well.
Yeah, it's I think that's one of the areas where there's the most research that still needs to be done, and to a certain extent it's a little bit of it's a difficult question to answer, but it's how to optimize your training time, right? That's like a really abstract question, but it's a great question. As you just said, that's kind of like the $1 million question is, whether you're in the off season or once you're in the in season, what gets you the most bang for the buck? I'm a firm believer that you need to train both acceleration and top speed qualities on a regular basis, both for performance and to reduce the risk of injury. So I do think you need to hit both qualities. But as it relates to acceleration, yeah, I think that potentially you're getting a lot of bang for your buck by doing some resisted sprint work as part of that. I think you wouldn't, just opinion here and not quantitatively backed up, but I think you wouldn't want to do all resisted sprinting. I think you'd certainly want to do some resisted and some unresisted, contrasting them potentially, that sort of thing. But yeah, I think you would want to keep some of that in at a lot of different parts of the training calendar. So
awesome. I know we've touched on a few things that are potentially coming out from your group, or by the time this comes out, have come out, hopefully. But is there anything past that, any exciting stuff that you've got in the pipeline?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we have a big data collection from the Westchester Performance Lab. Hopefully there's going to be a couple of things coming from that again. Looking at angular motion of the limbs, triangular velocity, that sort of thing, as it relates to speed and mechanisms of force application. And then also looking at another data set is just really going through some of the USA track and field, there's always just great data. I do some consulting with them and Dr. Ralph Mann and Amber Murphy, and we've got some exciting things that we're looking at now as it relates to again what makes fast people fast, and in that case with the track and field data, sub elite, if you will. So looking at differences between like practice and competition, which is in the track and field world really not that well known. Okay. So that's kind of next on tap from the research world, both from the Westchester lab and otherwise. So as you said, this is getting broadcast in 6 or 7 weeks. Hopefully there's more news on that by the time this hits air. But,
absolutely. Well, when it does come out, it's weird because I'm speaking as if it's happened, even though it's not. But yeah, hopefully it has come out and we can link to it and get that shared, and it will make a lot of sense when people listen and have a read of the paper.
For sure.
But Ken, thank you very much for coming on. I really do appreciate it. If people want to get to know more about you, research-wise, or even presentation-wise, especially during lockdown, because there's been plenty going on for you and for everyone else, online, of course. Where's the best place for people to go, and what resources can people get hold of?
Yeah, so I'm on social media at Ken Clark Speed, and then I'm proud to say just launched a website recently. So that's kenclarkspeed.com. So that's kind of a housing platform for all of the different resources, both research-wise, coaching-wise, social media, that sort of thing. So kenclarkspeed.com is probably the best place. So
Clark with no E. Clark
with no E, KENCLARK speed.com. Yep.
Awesome. So just tapping into that little bit of info, I didn't realize that was there. What's going to be on there, Ken? I'm always interested when people do these kind of things and set up websites and what kind of resources.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it really just grew out of necessity for, a place to kind of talk about all things speed. It's, I'm a one-trick pony, and that's really what I like to do is talk about the science and the application of speed and performance. So, links to some of my research and research that I've collaborated with others, links to online education and social media, and as I said, really just a housing platform for the various projects that I'm involved with, from a sports science, performance training, and speed training standpoints. So I think what's nice about that is before, whether it was doing a podcast or doing a presentation, people would ask, well, how can I get in contact with you or get a hold of resources? I had really no good answer. So with the broadcasting of the website now, it's kind of like it's just a nice place for me to organize it all.
So. Makes complete sense. Exciting times. I love it.
Yeah, it is exciting for sure.
Yeah. So. Well, thank you very much, Ken. Thank you for giving up an hour of your time, plus all the time in prep and getting this organized. I really do appreciate it.
Oh man, thank you so much for having me on, Rob. It's been great. It's always just fun talking about everything speed and performance related, and really a pleasure. This podcast is really incredible. I listen to it on a regular basis, and I'm honored just to be kind of among the guests that you've had on here. It's a really great resource for the sports performance community. So
thank you very much. Appreciate those kind words as well, and we'll keep in touch. Yep. And I'll speak to you soon.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken.